15 years ago, Tobias Redmont opened his front door to find his world in pieces. And he hadn't said a single word to another living soul since. Not one. Not even at the graves. Not even to God. The words had died with them, choked out of him by the smell of blood and ash, by the way his daughter's hair had still been warm when he'd held her for the last time. He buried them under the cottonwood where Sarah once braided wildflowers into their child's hair. No headstones, just two smooth river stones, round and silent as the man who placed them. The world called it a tragedy. Tobias called it the day language stopped mattering. The ranch survived because he made it, 12 miles from town, and just far enough from people to make forgetting easy. A place where the wind did the talking and the horses didn't ask questions. There were no mirrors inside the house, no clocks, only firewood, weathered beams, and a single worn photograph sealed in a tin box beneath the floorboards. If you're a true Wild West soul, drop a big yes in the comments. Let's see who's still riding the trail with us. Each morning he moved like a ghost through old routines. Hay for the horses, water drawn by hand, fences mended with the same nails he'd used for coffins. He never counted the days, but the sunrises had stacked like tombstones. He rarely used his voice, and when he did, cursing a broken stirrup or muttering to his mare, it rasped out like it belonged to someone else. Something cracked and unused, like an attic door rusted shut. At night, he sat by the hearth where no laughter lived anymore. The fire still burned, but the warmth didn't reach far. And the dreams, when they came, were always cruel. Sarah's hand brushing dust from their daughter's brow, her lips parting to say something Tobias could never quite hear before the world went red again. Silence had become more than comfort. It was survival, a shield, a vow. And so he didn't flinch when thunder rolled through the hills that evening, nor when lightning snapped across the sky like a warning shot from God himself. He was oiled to the storm, untouched, unmoved, until the knock came, hard. Not the hesitant tap of a neighbor, but something desperate, something wild. And for the first time in 15 years, Tobias Redmont stood up from his chair and listened. The storm didn't come in quietly. It shattered the stillness like a hammer through glass. Rain slashed across the windows in sheets, and the wind howled through the gaps in the shutters with a voice that didn't sound natural. The sky cracked open in flashes, each bolt revealing the bones of the land like a surgeon's cut. Brief, merciless, surgical. Tobias Redmont sat by the hearth with a needle in one hand and a leather strap in the other, mending an old bridle more out of ritual than need. Then came the knock, not a soft rapping or the cautious tap of a traveler in need. This was something else, a pounding, desperate, fast, as if the storm itself had found fists and was demanding to be let inside. Tobias didn't move at first. He just stared at the door, the thread dangling from his hand like a thought left unfinished. The fire behind him hissed as rain forced its way down the chimney. Another knock followed, harder this time, louder, urgent enough to raise gooseflesh on his arms. He set the bridle down slowly, listening, waiting. No one had knocked on his door in over a decade. He rose to his feet, movements slow and deliberate, as if he were trying not to wake something inside him. The rifle still hung above the fireplace, exactly where he'd placed it 15 years ago. He hadn't needed it since, but his hand reached for it now without thinking. Not for safety, for memory, for what that sound had once meant. The storm rattled the cabin as he stepped toward the door. Wind slammed against the walls like angry palms, and from behind the wood, voices. He froze. It wasn't the English he hadn't heard in years. It was the other tongue, one that turned his blood to ice. Apache. Soft, fragmented words carried by the wind, muffled by rain, but unmistakable. He hadn't heard that language since the night his life was taken from him, since the night strangers came to his door, and by morning he had 2 graves and no reason to speak again. The rifle came off the mantel like it had never been put down, but he didn't raise it, not yet. There was something in the tone, pleading, not threatening, broken, not cruel. A woman's voice rose above the rest, clearer now, speaking halting English. "Please, we know you're in there. We need shelter, just for tonight." Tobias pressed his palm flat against the wood. The knock had stopped, but he could feel the voices through the grain like tremors before an earthquake. Another storm had come to his door, and this time it wasn't made of wind and rain. The iron bar fought him. Years of rust, of never being moved, had welded it to the brackets like time itself was warning him, "Don't." The wind pushed at the seams of the door, cold and relentless, as if it too wanted to know what waited outside. Tobias's hand trembled, not from fear, but from something older, deeper. Instinct, memory. He lifted the bar. The door creaked open an inch, then more. The storm immediately pressing against it like a beast trying to force its way inside. For a moment, all he saw was darkness and rain. Then they appeared, 10 figures huddled together beneath the edge of the porch roof. Faces streaked with mud and rain, dresses clinging to them like second skins. Some were wounded. He could see the blood, dark and running thin with water. Others held each other up. One of them, no older than 16, clutched a bundle close to her chest. It stirred. A baby, barely breathing, wrapped in what looked like a torn shawl. But it was the woman in the center who held his attention. She stood slightly apart, her chin lifted in defiance despite the gash above her brow and the torn shoulder of her dress. Her eyes locked onto his without fear. "I am Ayana," she said, each word careful, carved out of exhaustion and will. "These are my sisters, my daughters, my people. We have been running for days." Tobias said nothing. The storm howled around them. His eyes swept over the group again, taking in every bruise, every bleeding cut, every face carved by cold and desperation. And still, his instincts screamed, not at them, at whatever had driven them to his door in a storm that could kill a man in minutes. His gaze dropped to the baby. The infant's lips were pale, barely moving. He stepped back. No words, just space. Ayana nodded once, sharp and fast, and the women moved past him like smoke, silent, shivering, trailing the scent of blood and rain. They filled the room with something Tobias hadn't felt in years. Life, even if only the kind trying desperately not to die. Ayana was last. As she passed him, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "They are close, maybe an hour, maybe less. They will not stop until we are dead." Tobias closed the door. The bar slid back into place with a sound that felt like a decision made. This house had been his tomb for 15 years. Now it was a sanctuary, or a battleground. The rain softened, but the weight in the room did not. It hung in the air like gunpowder smoke before the shot. The 10 women gathered near the fireplace, their clothes steaming as the heat chased away the cold. Some tended to wounds in silence. Others sat like statues, eyes fixed on the floorboards as if listening for footsteps that hadn't arrived yet. Tobias stood with his back to the door, the bar secure, though it felt like a twig against what he sensed was coming. Ayana stepped forward. Her face looked carved from stone, but her voice carried something raw beneath it. "They are soldiers," she said, her English rough but steady. "And maybe more. Led by a man named Morrison. He comes with papers, uniform, law, but he brings no justice." She looked at Tobias like she needed him to understand not just the words, but the weight behind them. He came to our village, said we were hiding fighters, said we had stolen horses. Lies, all lies. We grew corn. We raised our children. We asked no one for anything. Her voice caught just slightly. He took our men first. Then the fire came, the screaming. The girls who were too young to run. She didn't finish. One of the older women turned her head away, hiding her face in her hands. Tobias felt something ancient stir in his chest. Not pity. Not yet. Just recognition. He'd seen soldiers like Morrison before. Men who wore uniforms but used them like wolf pelts. Men who spoke of duty and carried torches. He hadn't known their names, but he'd seen their work. Once in Kansas, once in New Mexico, and one morning on his own land. "What do they want from you?" he asked, his voice so hoarse it barely sounded human. Ayanna's eyes met his. "They want silence, the kind that burns down homes and buries bones. We didn't die quiet, so now they chase us, to finish it, to erase what was done." The fire cracked, sending sparks up into the chimney. One of the children whimpered in her sleep. "They say we are fugitives," Ayanna continued, "but they are hunting ghosts of their own crimes. If we live, we tell. If we tell, he hangs." "And you came here," Tobias said. She nodded. "You have no friends, no neighbors, no reason to lie for us. That is why we chose this place, because you have nothing left to lose." Tobias looked around the room, at the shadows, at the blood drying on the floor, at the rifle leaning against the door. He wasn't sure if they'd brought war to his doorstep, or if they'd simply reminded him it had never really left. They moved like they'd done this before. Tobias didn't see it at first, not until the silence began to shift, not until the firelight flickered across hands that weren't just warming themselves, but checking blades. Fingers brushed against hems, but the gestures weren't idle. They were counting, checking, communicating. He stood by the window, watching the storm thin into a drizzle. The moon was rising behind clouds like a dimmed lantern. From the corner of his eye, he caught one of the younger women slipping a curved blade from beneath her skirt. She didn't look at it, didn't need to. Her fingers knew the weight. Another, older, knelt beside the fireplace, adjusting the position of a chair. At first glance, it seemed random. But then Tobias realized she was clear in a line of sight. They weren't resting. They were preparing. He turned slowly, studying the room that had once been his tomb. These weren't refugees, not in the way he understood the word. There was something practiced in their stillness, controlled, and beneath the blood and bruises, a kind of fire that no storm could put out. Ayanna met his gaze. She was sitting, but not relaxed. She watched everything, the door, the windows, her people. Tobias had seen generals with less awareness. "You've done this before," he said. Her silence was answer enough. "You're not just running." Still nothing. And then, "No." Her voice was low, almost gentle. "We came here to end it." Tobias looked at her fully now, as if seeing her for the first time. "You chose this place." "You were part of the plan," she said. "A man alone, forgotten. No ties, no loyalties. We thought maybe you'd stay out of the way. And if I hadn't opened the door, we would have forced it, or died trying." A pause stretched between them, long and taut as wire. Ayanna stood. Her movements were quiet, controlled. She crossed the room to him and stopped within reach, but not within comfort. "They think we are victims. That's their mistake. We let them believe it. Let them see torn dresses and tired faces." Her fingers brushed the gash above her eyebrow. "Let them see what they want to see." Tobias glanced again at the weapons now not quite hidden. "You're soldiers. We're survivors, but the line is thin. Outside, the wind shifted, and with it came a sound Tobias hadn't heard in years. Hoofbeats, distant but growing. A dozen, maybe more. Riders. Ayanna didn't flinch. This is where it ends, here, with you or without you. Tobias looked at the rifle leaning in the corner, at the floor where Sarah once read stories to their child, at the scars he thought had closed. Maybe they had chosen this ground, but maybe, just maybe, it had chosen him too. The first thing they heard was the horses, not the thunder of a charge, but the deliberate, coordinated trot of men who believed they were already victorious. Boots splashed in the mud outside, followed by clipped voices, barked orders, the metallic clink of rifles being unshouldered. Ayanna had taken position by the hearth, her face cast in firelight and shadow. Around her, the others moved like ghosts, silent, fast, unseen. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a trap. Tobias stood near the front window, peering through a gap in the shutters. Shapes moved in the rain, 7, maybe 8. Captain Morrison led them, striding like a man who'd already decided how the night would end. His arrogance was palpable, even in silhouette. "They'll come through the front," Tobias muttered. "They always want to make a show of it." Ayanna nodded without looking at him. "Then we show them something they've never seen." The knock came, not desperate this time, but commanding. 3 firm raps, the sound of a man used to being obeyed. Tobias didn't answer. "Open up," Morrison's voice boomed. "We know you're harboring fugitives. Step aside and we won't burn the place down." Ayanna gave the signal. A mirror caught the firelight and flickered once. Positions confirmed, blades ready, guns loaded. Tobias raised the latch. The door exploded inward before he could pull it open, Morrison kicking it with theatrical violence, rifle up, face tight with false authority. But what he saw wasn't fear. It was the barrel of Tobias Redmont's Winchester pointed at his chest. That second of confusion, barely a breath, was all Ayanna needed. She moved like water in firelight. One moment Morrison stood alone in the doorway. The next her blade was at his ribs. He had just enough time to recognize her before steel slid between his bones. "For my sister," she whispered. Morrison dropped his rifle, gasped, fell, and chaos bloomed. 2 soldiers rushed the porch and were met with blades in the dark. One never made it past the threshold. Another woman burst from the shadows and slashed at the knees of a third before disappearing again. Screams broke the rain. Rifles fired blindly into the night, striking nothing but mud and wooden beams. Tobias fired once, hitting a man trying to circle the house. Another Apache woman dropped from the loft, knife in hand, and brought a soldier down before he could scream. They never had a chance. Morrison's men had come for scared women and an old man with too many ghosts. Instead, they'd found something ancient, something waiting. The silence afterward was heavier than the storm. Bodies lay in the mud, blood mixing with rain. Tobias looked down at Morrison, his eyes wide and glassy, mouth still twitching. "That's your mistake," he said quietly. "You thought we'd already lost." Morrison hit the floor with a sound Tobias would never forget. Not loud, not violent, just final. A body realizing it no longer had a purpose. Ayanna knelt beside him only long enough to watch the last flicker leave his eyes, then stood without ceremony. The man who had burned villages, murdered families, and laughed while doing it now bled quietly on the old wooden planks of Tobias's home. Outside, the storm hissed as if it too was catching its breath. The women didn't cheer. There were no cries of triumph, only movement. Fast, calculated. They stripped weapons from the fallen, dragged bodies into shadow, reset positions. No hesitation, no panic. They worked like a single body with many hands. Tobias moved with them, reloading his rifle, glancing at Ayanna for the next step. It struck him that none of this had been improvised. It had all been prepared. They'd been waiting for this moment, for Morrison to underestimate them, to walk blind into their blade. And he had. But the victory felt wrong in Tobias's gut. Too easy, too clean. Then he heard it. Distant. Hooves. He stepped out onto the porch, the rain now a whisper on the wind. His boots sank slightly in the mud and blood as he scanned the horizon. Through the thinning mist, the first torchlight appeared, then another, then more. Not 7, not 10. Dozens. He backed inside. "They're coming," he said. Ayanna didn't ask how many. She didn't need to. She could see it in his face. The others had already sensed it, tightened their grips, moved closer to cover. This hadn't been a raid. It had been an opening move. Morrison was the blade. Someone else was the hammer behind it. "How long?" she asked. 10 minutes, Tobias said. "Maybe less." She glanced toward the back of the house, where the youngest of their group crouched protectively over the sleeping baby. Then back to the front door, where Morrison's blood was already soaking into the floor. "We can't fight that many," one woman muttered. "We're not running," another replied. Ayanna turned to Tobias. "Is there anywhere to hide?" "There's a root cellar, stone walls, hidden entrance. Won't hold off fire, but—" "We don't hide," Ayanna interrupted. "Not anymore." Tobias looked around his ruined cabin. It had held memories once, then silence, now blood. And somewhere in that cycle, he'd found himself again. Not the man he was before, maybe not even better, but awake. Another torch appeared outside, then another. "They think we're broken," Ayanna said softly. "Let's make them bleed for that mistake." Tobias chambered around. The sound echoed in the small space like a promise. Then he whispered to the room, more to himself than anyone else. "Let's give them justice." The baby's cry cut through the night like a blade through cloth, thin, high, and terrified. Tobias froze. So Dedan de Vrouwen. The Apache child near the hearth was silent, wrapped tight, and watched over. This cry was coming from outside. Ayanna heard it too. Her head snapped toward the door, eyes narrowing. One of the women reached for her knife. "That's not ours," she said flatly. Outside, the soldiers moved, shadows pacing behind firelight, shaping the outline of a noose around the house. The cry came again, weaker now, as if the storm itself tried to swallow it. "Could be a trick," someone muttered. "No," Tobias said. "That's real." He didn't wait for agreement. He stepped into the storm again, rifle lowered but ready. Rain had become mist now, fine and cold against his face. The torches burned brighter without the downpour, revealing shapes. Men, horses, wagons. The cry led him to a supply cart, half covered with canvas, parked behind a line of crates. Tobias moved carefully, stepping between pools of standing water and piles of discarded gear. Then he saw her, a young woman, no older than 20, crouched inside the wagon, arms wrapped around a crying infant. She wore a camp apron, sleeves rolled, eyes wild. The baby, barely weeks old, squirmed in her arms, face flushed, lungs weak. "Don't shoot," the woman whispered. "Please, she's done nothing." Tobias lowered his rifle completely. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mary," she breathed. "Mary Hendricks. I cook, wash. They made me come." She looked at him, truly looked, and something shifted. Not fear, at least not for herself, only for the child. Captain Morrison said it was just a raid, said the women were dangerous. Tobias clenched his jaw. Morrison's lies had killed more than soldiers. "I was going to flood the valley," he said, almost to himself. Mary stared at him. "There's a dam upriver. Blast it during a storm like this? The whole plain below turns into a grave." Mary's face went pale. "The baby," she said. "I know." For a long moment the night held still. Then Tobias stepped back and waved her out of the cart. "When shooting starts again, you run for the creek. Head south till you find a trading post. 5 miles. Tell them Tobias Redmont sent you." She hesitated. "What about you?" He didn't answer. Behind him, the women were preparing again, and up the hill, the dynamite still waited in a locked cabinet. But some lines didn't bend. They broke. He looked at the baby, now quiet, nestled in Mary's arms, too small to understand the weight of this night. "I won't kill a child to win a war," Tobias said softly, "no matter who her father is." He turned and walked back into the dark, knowing justice would have to find a different way. The cry was gone now, not because the danger had passed, but because the child was too tired to scream. Tobias crouched low beneath the ridgeline behind his house, mud soaking through his trousers, his rifle cradled in both hands like a promise he didn't want to keep. Behind him, 3 Apache women moved in silence. One checked her blade, another fixed something to a tree trunk, wire, thin and nearly invisible. Every movement was muscle memory. These weren't women hiding from war. They were war. Up the hill, near the house, Ayanna and the others began their performance. A door slammed, furniture overturned, then gunfire, loud and erratic, enough to sound like panic. Screams followed, some real, most not. Soldiers took the bait like starved wolves. Tobias could hear them shouting, organizing, charging the house. The distraction worked. He slipped around the perimeter, ducking between cover. The line of torches guarding the supply wagon thinned. Soldiers scrambled toward the noise, drawn like moths to fire. Only 2 remained near the cart now, watching nervously, unsure whether to hold or follow. One lifted a lantern to peer into the dark. Tobias struck before he could shout. A blow to the throat, fast and silent. The second man turned and caught a blade between the ribs. He didn't even cry out before he fell. The Apache woman who dropped him didn't stop to check his pulse. Mary was still there, curled up under the wagon's axle, the baby limp in her arms, eyes wide with exhaustion. "We're going," Tobias said. She didn't argue. He led them back the way he'd come, the women forming a tight circle around the young mother. Every few steps they paused, listened, adjusted. The gunfire from the house grew more intense. The soldiers hadn't realized yet they were firing into smoke and empty space. Halfway to the tree line, the wind shifted and brought with it a sound Tobias didn't expect. More hoofbeats, coming fast. From the south, he dropped to one knee, scanning the darkness. There, torches. At least a dozen. Uniforms he couldn't make out yet, but the way they moved told him everything he needed to know. Disciplined, clean. Reinforcements, but not for them. He turned to the women beside him. "New force, organized. They'll reach the house in minutes." Mary clutched her baby tighter. The infant whimpered softly, sensing what they all knew. Their victory had lasted less than half an hour. They weren't in a battle. They were in the middle of one that had only just begun. The fire had nearly died when the boy stumbled in through the back. He was young, barely a man, mud on his uniform and panic in his eyes. The barrel of Tobias's rifle was at his chest before the door had closed behind him, but it was Ayanna who moved first. Her knife flashed once and the boy froze, hands raised, breath stuttering. "I'm not here to fight," he said. "You picked the wrong door," Tobias muttered. Ayanna circled him slowly, watching every twitch of his muscles. "Who are you?" The boy swallowed hard. "Lieutenant James Bradley, 2nd Company, 3rd Infantry." Ayanna stopped. Her blade didn't lower. "Bradley?" He nodded. "My father commands the regiment." Silence hit the room like thunder. Outside, the wind shifted. and with it came the sound of boots. Not dozens, hundreds. Orders barked with authority, metal and leather and rain. Colonel Bradley had arrived. From the shadows of the window, Tobias saw them form a ring around the house. Torches lit the fog like a noose tightening. And then the voice came, calm, clear, measured. "This is Colonel Bradley. Surrender the fugitives and no one else needs to die." Ayanna didn't move, neither did the boy. "You think he'll spare us if we hand you over?" Tobias asked. James shook his head. "I don't know." Ayanna's grip tightened on the boy's collar. "We kill him, the father burns this place to the ground. We let him live. He goes back and lies for them." "He doesn't have to lie," Tobias said. "He can tell the truth." Ayanna's gaze snapped to him, sharp and cold. "The truth didn't save my village." "No," Tobias replied, "but maybe it can damn his father." Outside, Bradley's voice returned. "If you harm my son, there will be no negotiation." Ayanna pulled the boy closer, the blade now at his throat. "Let me talk to him," James said suddenly. "Please, let me try." She hesitated, then nodded. Tobias hauled a chair to the shattered doorway. James stepped into the light, his hands visible. "Father," he shouted, "there's something you need to hear." A long pause, then, "Are you hurt?" "No, but I've seen what they've done, what we've done, and you need to answer for it." The torches outside flickered. Bradley's voice trembled barely. "Son, you don't know what you're saying. I do now." Inside, Ayanna stood like stone. Tobias watched her carefully. Her hand still held the knife, but her grip had loosened. Outside, the silence stretched, and then came the first sound of boots stepping back. Just a few, but enough to know the noose was fraying. Dawn came slow, not just in the sky, but in the bones. The kind of light that doesn't rush in but tests the ground first, softening shadows that had ruled the night. Smoke still curled from what was left of Tobias Redmont's porch. Blood stained the grass. The house leaned like a man who'd taken too many blows but refused to fall. Colonel Bradley stood in chains. His hands, once used to giving orders that killed innocents, now trembled at his sides. The federal marshals had arrived at first light, summoned by a quiet message passed through the ranks by a lieutenant with his father's jawline but not his cruelty. James had spoken. He'd told everything, about the villages, the lies, the fires. The women who were hunted not for what they'd done, but for what they'd survived. And now his voice echoed in the testimony of others who had been afraid to speak, until someone younger, someone with his father's blood but not his shame, broke the silence. Ayanna watched from a distance. She didn't celebrate. She didn't weep. Justice was never clean. It didn't bring back the ones buried beneath scorched earth, but it gave her people space to breathe again. "We ride north," she told Tobias, "to kin who escaped the burning." He nodded, eyes drifting to the youngest girl who held the baby tight to her chest. The child lived. So did Mary Hendricks, who stood beside the broken gate with blistered feet and a fire in her eyes no man would put out again. "I'll take her as far as Denver," Tobias said. "Make sure the baby gets there breathing." Ayanna gave a single nod, not of gratitude, of understanding. They were both protectors now, forged by a night neither would ever forget. The Apache women rode out quietly, vanishing into morning mist like the storm had imagined them. No fanfare, just a silence earned by survival. Tobias stood on the steps of the house that no longer stood. The roof was gone, the inside blackened with smoke and memory. 15 years he'd built walls to keep the world out. And one night those walls had fallen, and somehow he was still standing. He looked west, not for answers, just for direction. Mary stepped beside him, the baby asleep against her chest. "Why'd you help us?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away, just looked down at his hands, still stained but steady, because someone had to. She smiled, small and tired. He saddled the horse, helped her up. Then Tobias Redmond climbed into the saddle beside her, turned his back on the ruin, and rode toward the rising sun, not to run from ghosts, but to live beyond them. That's the end of the trail, folks. Drop a yes if you're a true Wild West fan. Thanks for riding with me.